So you've retired and you're following the 4% rule to determine how much you can spend each year in retirement. Raises a big question. Is it possible to safely do better than the 4% rule? Can we actually spend more than what the 4% rule would tell us we can spend without a serious risk of running out of money in retirement? That's the question we're going to tackle in today's video. Hey everybody, my name is Rob Berger. This is the Financial Freedom Show, where we talk about investing, retirement, and financial freedom. If those topics are important to you, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel. I also send out a free newsletter every Sunday morning. You can sign up for that with the link below this video. So today we're going to be talking about something called the Ratcheting Rule. It was developed by Michael Kitces. He's a certified financial planner, does a lot of research in the area of retirement planning. He's been on the show in the past, and he's written about the Ratcheting Rule. And that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. And I want to begin by putting it into some context, starting with the 4% rule. As you probably know, it was developed by Bill Bingen in a paper published in 1994. And it basically says this. It says, look, you can start your retirement in the first year spending 4% of your investments, and then you can increase that annual spending amount by the rate of inflation each year. And if you do that, at least based on historical market returns and historical inflation in the United States, your money should last at least 30 years. But here's the catch. 4% based on historical analysis is actually the worst case scenario. In most years, and they've done this research, believe it or not, going all the way back to 1871, in the vast majority of cases, you could have actually started with a higher initial spending rate. And let me show you. This is the Ratcheting Rule article that Michael Kitces wrote. I will link to it below this video. But in this article, he has a chart. Now, I apologize. Some of this is maybe a little blurry, but it's the best I could do to enlarge it. But what we've got is, along the bottom are the years 1871 all the way through to 1985. And then on the left, we have initial withdrawal rates ranging from 0% all the way to the top of 10%. And you can see this red line here. That's where the actual 4% rule comes from. That's associated with the year 1966. When they go back and look at 30-year retirements beginning all the way back in 1871, it turns out that if you retired in 1966, it was the worst time to retire. That's what gives us the 4% rule. You can start with 4% in 1966, but by the end of 30 years, you've basically, you've survived. You've gotten through the 30 years, but you're basically broke. But as you can see, what Michael Kitces did is he said, well, let's recalculate the initial withdrawal percentage for all of the years. From 1871, he went through 1985. And as you can see, they were significantly higher most of the time. Of course, some of them, this is the 9% line here. Some of them were well above 9%. This is back in the 1800s, it was almost 10%. But we can even come up here in the late 1970s and 1980s. You had a number of years where the initial withdrawal rate was around 8%, one almost as high as 9%, and that underscores sort of the problem we have as retirees. Are we retiring in a year that will turn out to be like 1966, that's 4%, not so good, but okay? Or are we retiring, say, in the late 70s or early 80s, where we could have started with 8% or higher and still had a safe 30-year retirement? The problem is we don't know ahead of time. Now, if we go back to these charts, we can see how this actually affects a retiree's portfolio. This chart assumes a $100,000 initial portfolio when you retired, and it tracks how much you would have had left. This is not factoring in inflation. How much you would have had left after a 30-year retirement. You can see there are several down here that are actually you end up with less than you started with. And of course, one of the worst here is 1966. 1937 turned out to be bad as well. But most of the time, you end up with more money than you started with after 30 years. And in many cases, significantly more money. We can see here, when you retired in the 70s and maybe early 80s, you didn't end up with 100,000, your starting balance. You ended up with $600,000, $700,000, $800,000, even $900,000. We can look at these same numbers on an inflation-adjusted basis. That's what this graph does. And so because it's adjusted for inflation, there are certainly more years where you end up with less than $100,000 on an inflation-adjusted basis. But even adjusting for inflation, there's plenty of times where you end up with more and significantly more. And that raises sort of the big question for today's video. Is there any way to know, as we're moving through retirement, are things working out pretty good and maybe we can spend a little bit more money? Or do we have to batten down the hatches, things are not going well, and we really can't spend more money? Now, this kind of approach to retirement spending is referred to as dynamic spending rules. The 4% rule is what they would call static. Yes, you're increasing the amount you spend each year by the rate of inflation, but that's it. So on an after inflation basis, you're spending the exact same amount of money each and every year. So in that sense, Bill Bingen's 4% rule is considered a static spending rule. Dynamic spending rules adjust how much you spend from year to year on an after inflation basis. One of the most popular is called guardrails, sometimes referred to as Guyton guardrails, after Jonathan Guyton, who's done a lot of research on this. And in fact, here's the paper by Jonathan Guyton and Bill Klinger, sometimes just referred to as Guyton-Klinger. I will link to this article below the video. But what they proposed was guardrails. So you might start, let's say, with a 5% withdrawal rate, but each year you'd adjust for inflation, but then you'd also calculate what percentage of your portfolio you're spending. And if it went above 6%, that was sort of an alert. Problems ahead, you're spending too much and you have to cut back. On the other hand, if your spending went below 4%, that might mean things are going pretty well and you can increase your spending. That was the guardrail approach. What Michael Kitces proposed, the ratcheting rule, works a little differently. So here's the deal. With guardrails, you can start with a higher initial spending rate. As I mentioned, just as a hypothetical, Guyton-Klinger, maybe you start at 5%, right? Better than 4%. But there's a downside, right? There's no free lunch. When you start with that higher rate, you have to be prepared to cut your spending. There are guardrails on both sides. So if things don't go well, you have to cut your spending. So what Michael Kitces thought was, well, is there a way where we never have to cut our spending? We can increase our spending if things are going well, but at least based on historical data, we never have to cut our spending. And that gave him the ratcheting rule. And so the way it works is this. You start with 4%. Remember, there's no free lunch, so you don't get to start with the 5% that you might with Guyton-Klinger guardrails. You start with 4%, just like the Bill Bingen rule, but you can increase your spending if things are going well. And how do we calculate that? Well, under the ratcheting rule, it was pretty straightforward. What you would do is each year you would compare your balance in your portfolio to the balance you started with when you first began, when you first retired. So let's just imagine, just for a sake of a round number, you retired with $100,000. You'd start with 4% of that. You'd adjust that for inflation every year, but then you'd also look at your balance. And what you'd be looking for is this. Does your balance ever go above 150% of what you started with? So if you started with 100 grand, 150% of that would be $150,000. So you'd be looking to see if the balance in your portfolio ever went above $150,000. And if it does, in the year that it goes above $150,000, you can increase your spending by 10%. That's how it works, pretty straightforward. Now, there was another part to the ratcheting rule that was very important because Michael Kitces was very concerned about avoiding the need to cut your spending. He didn't want a situation where, your portfolio went up, you got that 10% increase, and then the markets went south again and you had to cut your spending later on. So he added another element to the ratcheting rule. What he said was, if it goes above, in this case, $150,000, great, you get your 10% bonus. However, you can't get another 10% bump for at least 3 years. Once you get a bump, you have to wait 3 years, and then you can again begin evaluating your portfolio to see, is it still above $150,000? If it is, great, you get another 10% increase. If it's not, you just keep evaluating each year until it does. And then once it does, again, you get that 10% bonus, and then you've got to wait 3 years before you can reevaluate for a potential another 10% increase. And what he found when he looked at the historical data going back well over 100 years was that there was never an instance, if you followed the ratcheting rule, where you would have to decrease your spending. Now, that raises a big question. Fine, we don't have to decrease our spending, but how often do we get to increase our spending? Well, that depends on how well that 30-year period when you retire, how well the markets work and what inflation rate is, but he did give us a chart that shows us that. So in this chart, he compared 3 different starting years for retirement. The red line is 1966, the orange line is 1973, and the blue line is 1982. Now, if you look at 1966, you can see the red right here. You'll notice it stays at $4,000. This is assuming a $100,000 starting portfolio. It never ratcheted up, not even once, over 30 years. Now, that should not come as a surprise to us. Remember, 1966 was the worst year to retire, at least going back to 1871. And you just barely finished the 30 years with any money left over. And so, yeah, your portfolio never went above that 150% threshold. So if you happen to retire in a year like 1966, you wouldn't get any increases. But the good news is you could still adjust your spending each year for inflation without taking any cuts. Now, if we go back and look at 1973, this may surprise folks because 1970s were rough. Inflation was high. 73 and 74 were very bad years for the stock market. And so it did take, as you can see, a number of years before you got an increase. You're not until year 17 into 18 that you get your first 10% increase. But now we're into the 1980s. As we know, inflation started to come down. Stock market did well. And so they got regular bumps throughout the rest of the 30-year period. With 1982, of course, this was the end of the high inflation era. Interest rates were coming down. Stock market, of course, it didn't do great every year, but by and large did very well. And you can see if you retire in a year like 1982, you can increase your spending. As you see here, boy, it was about every 3 years for 30 years. You ended up, rather than taking out $4,000 a year adjusted for inflation, by the end of retirement, you were well above $9,000. So that's it. That's the ratcheting rule. One of the nice things about it is it's simple, it's easy to apply. And again, based on historical data, we don't know what the future is going to hold, but based on historical data, you never had to take a spending cut. I do think there's at least one downside to the ratcheting rule, and that is, yes, you get to increase your spending as you move through retirement, but I think a lot of folks would rather spend more money early in retirement, perhaps when they're doing more traveling in their 60s and 70s than they might do in their 80s or 90s. And the ratcheting rule doesn't really accommodate that in most cases. You increase your spending, but a lot of those increases may come in your 80s and 90s when you have less need for the money. So keep that in mind as you decide what's best for you. The other thing I'll mention is all of this analysis assumes a 30-year retirement. But what if you've retired early and maybe you're thinking of 40 or even a 50-year retirement? The ratcheting rule doesn't apply in that scenario. The assumption was a 30-year retirement, but I will leave a link below the video to an article. In fact, I'll show it to you quickly. It's right here, another Michael Kitces article, The Problem with Firing at 4% and the Need for Flexible Spending Rules. So if you're thinking of retiring early, I think this would be a good article to read. Flexible spending rules, same thing as dynamic spending rules. They become very, very important, I think really in all retirements, but certainly if you retire early. So there you go. That's the ratcheting rule. I think it's at least worth considering as adding it to your toolbox for retirement spending. Again, it's not perfect, but it might be one way to safely increase your spending if the markets and inflation smile upon us. There you go. Hope that's helpful. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll be happy to help you out any way I can. And until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.